Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we try to cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff.
And I'm Jay McKenzie.
On this episode of Did Nothing Wrong, we are joined by Asha Rangappa. Asha is a senior lecturer at the Yale University Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and a former associate dean at Yale Law School. Prior to her current position, Asha served as a special agent in the New York division of the FBI, specializing in counterintelligence investigations. Asha has been a contributor on numerous television and radio outlets and is now a legal and national security analyst. Her Substack is called Freedom Academy. We're extremely lucky to have her on the show today. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a rating and a review on the app that you're listening on. Be sure to subscribe at didnothingwrongpod.com to get our content straight into your inbox. All of our work is free, but we're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that ensure that we can keep doing this important work. Thank you. Asha, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Did Nothing Wrong.
Thank you for having me.
So, Asha, you run a Substack page called the Freedom Academy. I read your About page where you explain the origin for this name, which I found as fascinating as I think you did too. And you wrote that you want to use your platform to, quote, educate and create a community around understanding the threat of disinformation and its impact on democracy. So, how does raising public awareness of these issues help us as a nation moving forward?
Yeah, my background with propaganda and disinformation comes from my time in the FBI. This was soon after 9/11. I joined the FBI. I was placed in the counterintelligence division. And the cases I worked mainly involved what the FBI calls perception management operations by foreign intelligence services. Now, remember in the early 2000s, this is before social media. This is even before like the major internet explosion, right? So this was mainly analog media type of propaganda and disinformation. And it didn't feel like that big of a threat. Like when I was looking around, and especially after 9/11, I'm like, really? Like this is what we're combating? But one thing that, I did learn about those types of operations and how you neutralize them, that's the intelligence term, to render them ineffective, is you expose them. That when people know what is, how they are trying to be cognitively manipulated, they become more resistant and resilient to it. And so raising awareness is really the antidote to disinformation because it makes people be more critical of how they're consuming information, what they're consuming, understanding it, thinking about their reactions to it. And I think that's especially important in an information age where it's just coming at us so fast. I think all of us have been duped by disinformation at one point or another. Yeah. So, just understanding how it works and what the goals are from our adversaries. And sadly, I think many of those tactics have now been adopted by domestic actors. But just to understand them, I think is really critical in terms of preserving our democracy.
I don't know if you've looked into this or studied it yourself, but do we have any examples in the real world of countries, say post-Soviet, the Baltic states, or are there any examples of a success on a large scale in a foreign country? Has that really happened yet? Or I know those states are more aware of something like Russian disinformation and propaganda, and they kind of learn that by necessity. But is that kind of a template for you and for us going forward?
You mean in terms of combating?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the countries, especially around the former Soviet bloc states, I think, they have been on the front lines of this for a while. And what we need to understand is that all states engage in this, but Russia is sort of the OG, okay, of disinfo and propaganda. Yeah. This is the KGB, active measures, which goes back to the Cold War. This is sort of where my Substack begins. All countries engage in this, but Russia is really the one to look at for understanding a sophisticated actor in this space. And, the countries around them have learned how to combat it to different degrees, and I think are much better at understanding it. I mean, look at, for example, right now in Ukraine, President Zelensky is very savvy about combating Russian narratives in the information space. He completely understands that this is a kinetic war, but it's also a war that's being fought for the hearts and minds of not just Ukrainians, but also the world, right? And so he's been very savvy about that. We in the United States are really naive. And what Russia has done is they've kind of practiced. They practice on their own people. They practice around, the satellite countries around them, and they've slowly moved westward. And so perfecting their technique each time. And I do think we can look to some of those countries and how they're engaging and reacting as templates.
Yeah, as you mentioned Zelensky, and I feel like part of the reason they dislike him so much is because he's just so good at this. He's kind of surprised everyone to an extent of how well he's handled this war in the information space, but they get frustrated and irritated with him because he knows how to raise money and raise awareness and keep Ukraine in the public discussion, and they don't want any of that.
Yeah, he's, there's sometimes when you look at history and you realize there's the perfect person that was there for that moment. And I think he's the perfect person for this moment for Ukraine, because he not only understands Russia's tactics, he's a performer.
Yeah.
And so he also understands audiences and how you connect and things like that sometimes politicians don't. You know, that not all politicians are necessarily good at that. I think he is perfect for this moment, and I can totally see why Russia would. And he's more sympathetic. I think people do connect with him and see him as a representative of the Ukrainian people.
So, since we're talking about the Russians being sort of the OGs of all of this type of work, you wrote a recent article about the old Soviet term reflexive control. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how it's being used against us today?
Yes, reflexive control is essentially a Russian psychological warfare tactic. And really, it's about getting your adversary to reach the conclusion that you want. Okay. And so what you do is you understand your adversary's thought process. You understand their logical reasoning, and you plant assumptions at key points into their reasoning process. So their decision tree will basically end up where you want it to go. And they believe that they've come to that conclusion all on their own, and you really haven't had to do much for it, right? This is a very effective way of battling an adversary because it doesn't require guns and bombs. Your adversary may not even know that you're doing it. They don't know that they're manipulated to get to the outcome that you want. It's a great tool, especially for weaker states that don't have the hard power that we do. And Russia is very good at this. They are incredibly good students of their targets. I mean, they really take the time to understand, the populations that they're targeting. And they understand that what they need to do in Ukraine is going to be different than what they need to do in Poland. And that's going to be different than what they need to do in France and the US, because they really take the time to understand what is it that drives these people, what makes them tick, how do they think. These are the champions of the world in chess, right? And I think in that piece I said, we play checkers. We kind of do our moves. They're big moves, with our hard power, economic sanctions and all this stuff, but we're not so good at this long game of psychological warfare.
So following that up a little bit, the people who have been effective in kind of outing that and combating that, is that, as you said earlier, a case of just putting sunlight on it? Or is there something that we can do to get ahead of that kind of thing as a society that does sometimes get targeted by these kinds of measures?
Yeah, I mean, it does. All of these require critically questioning the information that we're getting. And so, one of those is, what are the assumptions that this issue is based on? How is it being framed? Sometimes things are being framed in a way to get you to a particular outcome, and it doesn't have to be framed that way, right? I will say that in our domestic politics, I see Republicans doing this all the time. They're very good at framing issues in a specific way and forcing the adversary to, or their opponent, to engage on that issue in that, or debate it on those terms. And, the answer is change the terms, question the assumptions, create a new paradigm, and, flip it so that the other person's on the defensive. But reflexive control, remember, is about reactivity, right? Like it's kind of getting people to react to something, not just changing how they see something, but also how they are participating and responding to it.
Well, and this is why people should go subscribe to your Substack and get the paid features, because you have a very long article on this. It sounds really complex and difficult, and it's not that it's easy, but there's probably no one better that can break it down better than you and more capable and more qualified for that. So yes, go subscribe and learn more on her Substack. It is wonderful. In that vein, I did want to ask you, the sort of explainers you provide, it is long form work. People have to put the time in. They have to want to learn and want to kind of grow as a person. So what has the response been to the Freedom Academy from subscribers? Have they been up to the challenge?
I think so. People get a little overwhelmed because, they feel like, oh my God, I'm behind. I'm not caught up. I really do try to design it so that even if you have time to just read one of the articles, you don't have to have done all the 13 lessons before that or whatever. Also, in those posts, I include an audio. So, and that's on the bottom. Okay. So if you're driving or, on your jog or whatever, and you want to learn about reflexive control or hybrid warfare or active measures generally, you can do that and sort of multitask as well. But I think the response it's been really positive. I think it's opened their eyes, and I can definitely see that people who are engaged in it are understanding things that are happening in a different light. The aperture of their understanding I feel has been open, which is always rewarding to me as a teacher.
I feel like there is that desire out there, and people go looking for it, but there's so many different places to get your information now. It's hard to find. Even if you kind of think you know what you're looking for, it's hard to find it, because is it on TV? Is it in print? Is it on social media? So yeah, that's why I think it's so important to point people in your direction.
And when you find it, I just think people are overwhelmed, right? Like there's just so much information, and our attention spans have gotten smaller and smaller. I'm guilty of this. I subscribe to like 10 Substacks, and, I'm like, I have had to discipline myself. So when I'm waiting in a dentist's office, I'm not mindlessly scrolling through Twitter. I'm like, I'm going to read something substantive from someone who has expertise that I want to learn about. And I don't know how hopeful I am about us getting back to that type of habit, but I think it is a function of our 24/7 news cycle, scrolling news feeds, Twitter, social media atmosphere.
Yeah. You have to make a conscious decision to do it, because otherwise it is every 3 seconds here, 3 seconds there, 5 seconds there. So I did have a little longer question, and you'll have to bear with me, but I think it's worth asking. So you're a former special agent in the counterintelligence division of the FBI. You have a law degree. You were a former dean of admissions at Yale Law School. You're currently an assistant dean and senior lecturer at the Yale Jackson School of Global Affairs. It is an amazingly impressive resume. But my question is, did you ever expect with your background to spend so much of your time dissecting baseless conspiracy theories?
Definitely not. I mean, you would ask me in law school if this is where I would end up, or that I would be spending, 10 hours going down a rabbit hole about Hunter Biden's laptop. So to explain it to people, no, I would not. And, it kind of gets to this whole idea of things that used to be so fringe and that have become mainstream, right? I mean, if you had said, can you imagine yourself becoming a teacher or an explainer, somebody who's kind of doing this type of thing, I would have said maybe. But the substance of it, the reason that I'm doing like conspiracy theories and disinformation is because there's no gatekeepers anymore.
Right.
Right.
For better or worse. And that's a double-edged sword, but it used to be that we all had 3 channels that we watched. We got our news. There was no social media. People like Alex Jones would have just been ranting in some corner, some radio show that, might have had some listeners, but wouldn't have had the following that he has now.
Public access TV where he started.
And I think it really speaks to how much this nonsense has become mainstreamed. And I think that's the really dangerous part.
So speaking of nonsense that's become mainstream, as a former FBI agent, you must have noticed that there has been an amazing spike in extremely violent and hateful rhetoric towards the FBI, specifically on the part of a lot of the Republican Party and MAGA. So why do you think they're doing this at this point?
So I think that you can't disentangle that reaction from Donald Trump, right?
Right.
When you have a demagogue, someone who has authoritarian impulses, the first thing that has to go is the rule of law, because that's going to be a constraint on that person. Ideally, what you would have with somebody who is trying to do that is you have a critical mass of opposition who try to keep institutional guardrails in place and apply the rule of law. Because of our political polarization, people, I think, believe that their loyalty to Trump is more important than our institutions and the rule of law. And so they're on board with discrediting the FBI. I mean, who knew? Like, who would have imagined?
No.
Let's talk about things we would have imagined 20 years ago. That the Republican Party, the party of law and order, the one that has, that backs the blue,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Would be the ones talking about defunding the FBI. That would be denigrating the FBI for trying to investigate Russian election interference. I mean, it's really crazy.
You go back to the day after 9/11 and the world feels like it's turned upside down sometimes if you look back that far and you're like, really? This is where we are? This is insane.
Yeah, and the flip side, like, would you have ever expected like people on the left to be the champions of the FBI and the CIA and whatever? I mean, it's just we're in bizarro world right now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
We really are.
Yeah, it's crazy because if you subscribe to the notion that it is a Cold War 2.0, then the fifth column really for the authoritarian states, the enemies of America, are on the right. And who could have possibly predicted that?
Yeah, and one of the things I mentioned in my Substack about why, like, one of the barriers to active measures operations during the Cold War was because the KGB could not make inroads into the political right. Right. For a number of reasons. I mean, there was the conservative philosophy, law and order, communism was atheist. So you also had this idea that the religious prophylactic there. And now, they're really able to play both sides of the political spectrum, which greatly increases their ability to sow chaos. They don't have to be at the fringes anymore. And not only both sides, but it's asymmetric. On one side, they really are in the core mainstream part of that political party.
That's an interesting point right there, that they've kind of taken over the center to some extent. Their narrative has, at least, where more on the left, it's still on the fringes, but it's definitely there. You can see it in certain alternative news outlets that are very good about putting out exactly the same things. Like you take a look recently, Tucker Carlson got fired a couple days ago from Fox News, and you start to see certain left-wing outlets, ostensibly left-wing, defending that. And it's kind of like, are you out of your mind? This is insane. This guy's a propagandist, and this is a good thing, but they're selling it the same way the right-wing outlets are selling it. And it's kind of never been more obvious in a lot of ways what's going on here. Yeah,
the asymmetry is really important to understand. And you just highlighted it. There's extremism on both sides, but it's called asymmetrical polarization. So you can read scholarly articles about it, that basically both parties have moved, farther from the center, but the right has moved much farther from the center than the left has. in terms of media narratives, the media ecosystems are also asymmetrical. So whereas the center of gravity on left-leaning media, CNN, MSNBC, they're still tethered to mainstream media, which means that they still have traditional journalistic norms. They still police each other and themselves for being generally truthful, right? If biased. The right-wing media ecosystem, it is the center of gravity is Fox News, which is completely untethered to, like, they're not overlapping their audiences with, say, the people who read the Wall Street Journal news section. Right. Like,
no,
they're completely untethered from reality. There's no internal policing. And so they're just out in la la land. And it makes it, incredibly hard we basically have two different realities, which makes it hard to achieve any type of consensus or democratic deliberation or real debate or anything.
Well, and then you have someone like Tucker who has purported left-wing guests on his show who are not really, emblematic or a good representation of what the left really believes, but then the right thinks that is what the left believes. And so then the arguments and the fights are about things that are okay. There are some people on the left that might believe this extreme thing or that extreme thing, but there are millions of people in this country, and one or two who have some crazy ideas are not a representative sample. So I think losing Tucker is a great loss for the fringes.
Yes.
But we don't seem to know why. And I'm sure you've been following this, that we keep seeing different theories on this, and I don't expect you to know. None of us know. But do you think it's a combination of factors? Do you think that possibly the Dominion suit could have hurt Fox, or is that at least changing their plans going forward, perhaps?
It's hard to see how, based on what the Dominion lawsuit itself revealed, right? Like, this is a company that is so concerned about not losing their audience that they were willing to feed their audience what they wanted to hear, even knowing that it was false, because otherwise the audience was going to abandon them and not, by the way, go to, CNN or PBS or anything like that, but to go to OANN and Newsmax. I have to imagine, especially in light of their settlement, that they need to keep that audience. So, right. I mean, I don't know if they're just in a catch-22 now. Like, how do they do that without continuing to feed them these conspiracy theories that they believe, which clearly now is going to open them up to more liability. Right. So I think really the litmus test is going to be, who do they replace Tucker with? If they replace him with like Jesse Waters or something like that, like, no, they're not changing. And I think it's something besides the Dominion lawsuit, right?
Yeah.
If they really try to suddenly go moderate and they're willing to take that loss of audience share to try to move closer to the center and maybe draw, a more center right audience towards them, like to draw the people who read the Wall Street Journal news section to watch Fox News, maybe a portion of CNN's audience base or something like that, then, we'll see that in who they start replacing it with. I am very skeptical. I don't know about you.
No, yeah. Skeptical. Because for them to move to the center in any sort of moderating way, I think not only are they going to lose a whole ton of their core audience at this point, they're also going to have a really hard time bringing in anybody who has been paying attention over the last few years, who just especially on the more left side of things, that just doesn't trust Fox, period. The same right. as when CNN is trying to appeal to a more right-leaning crowd, seemingly without knowing that Fox and everybody else on that side of the fence has been bashing CNN really hard for the past almost 10 years now for being too liberal and too woke. And it's just, there's a trust barrier, and it's on both sides.
Yeah.
And I don't see
And
it.
I think that if that's what CNN is trying to do, then they fundamentally misunderstand they can probably draw people over from MSNBC.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like those audiences are overlapping. Like, they don't overlap with the audience at Fox. Those, as you just said, they're not going to come over to CNN. I don't understand if that's the if that's the play. I feel like it's going to be a losing play.
Right.
Yeah. The people who leave Fox from what I read on right-wing social media and posts, the people who leave Fox mostly leave Fox for Rumble or Telegram or something more extreme. And they kind of put up with Fox because of Tucker, because Tucker was a outlet for some of that extremist rhetoric, and it was a way to mainstream it. And so they put up with Fox, which they might call controlled opposition or something that they don't support. But yeah, people in that space tend to go more extreme, and there are plenty of more extreme alternatives out there. And I don't really see a whole lot of the right taking their foot off the gas. And if that's what Fox was hoping for, I don't understand how they're going to accomplish that at all.
It just happened so suddenly that I don't think it was a strategic decision.
He's not Megyn Kelly. This is not something that they're going to be able to just plug somebody else into that slot and keep moving. They're going to lose a lot of people who were, like Jay just said, only watching that network for Tucker to some reason. So I don't know what they're going to do. I can't think of an obvious replacement for him. There's really nobody that jumps out that would have that same level of appeal.
Dan Bongino.
They just fired him.
Yeah. And Tucker had to become Tucker. He wasn't this guy 10 years ago.
No.
Yeah, he decided this is a character he's going to take on, and I don't know if that's because he radicalized himself or he's bitter or what it is, but he made a conscious, or at least he didn't stop himself from becoming this person. And I don't know who else would do that, would be willing to do that. It's not like Sean Hannity can suddenly turn himself into Tucker. So I don't know where it goes from there.
So you've written a lot about Donald Trump's uncanny ability to hijack news coverage, influence narratives, and basically suck all the airtime out of the room. We're seeing a lot of the same mistakes of 2016 reappear as we gear up for 2024. So do you think the media is better prepared to deal with Trump this time, or have they refused to learn anything in the name of ratings?
I think they're a little better. What someone like Trump does is exploit norms, and particularly norms about silence and what you can say or not say. One of the mistakes that journalists had very early in his presidency is he's the president, so anything he says is newsworthy.
Right.
And everything that you report, you just report verbatim, because to try to correct something looks like editorializing, right? Which you don't do as a journalist. Well, if someone is telling, I forgot what the average number of lies he was telling a day is, if you're just reporting those verbatim without any type of correction or without saying, for example, if you just say Trump says millions of illegal people voted, and you don't say it as Trump falsely claims millions of illegal, like that, there's a difference in how you frame it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think they got a little bit better about that, about trying to acknowledge that he was lying. I don't know if they ever got to a point where they actually called him a liar, because that's a hard thing to do for the president of the United States. So they've gotten a little bit better. Jay, what do you think? I know you look at these types of questions also, things like framing and perception.
I think realistically, the public backlash and criticism has forced some of them to do slightly better. I think in general, I think it was easy in 2016 and 2017 to not see Trump as the threat that some of us did. I think the media said, well, he's ridiculous, but he's just a performer. And it's not great, but what's the real harm in some cases? I think after January 6th, I do feel like more journalists and more people are aware of the threat. They do look at the situation and say, yeah, democracy is in trouble and we can't go on like this forever. And so I think they are better at, the headlines and the little blurbs and the tweets and every little thing that I do think it's minor, but it makes a difference. I feel like you're right. It is a little better. There are some people that are probably the same as they were, and they just go about their day and their business. But I think most people have tried. I think obviously everyone still wants to get ahead with their career, and if it's a really kind of seductive story, you might be drawn into it or report it or frame it in a way that's favorable to Trump for access or influence or whatever. But I don't think it's as bad because people see we lived through 4 years of it, and you had to learn something through that. And you also you talk about the beginning of his presidency and taking him literally and putting out all of his statements and not editorializing with them. But it's also, you juxtapose that with the idea that at some point during his presidency, I don't remember who said it, but they said basically ignore his tweets. His tweets are not policy. His tweets are not, Trump may tweet about the war or sending troops in or removing troops. And it's not, no, that's not official. No, don't take that literally. No, the State Department shouldn't act on that. So we kind of had to adjust to the circumstances. It was forced on us, really.
Yeah. The other place where I thought journalists did a pretty good job was in the lead up to the 2020 election of setting expectations. It was really important to say, hey, it's going to take a while to count these votes, and we may not have a winner. To create a counter narrative. This is kind of like what you need to do, because as he was saying, and he was basically telegraphing that he was going to claim victory. And so, I don't know if they were consciously doing that, but the fact that they were setting expectations in such a way that, at least for the mainstream people who understood how the election was going to work, the big lie, didn't gain the kind of traction that it did. I think where they still have work to do, at least some networks, is in discussing the issues. As I mentioned before, they play on the turf in which the issue is presented. They need to both sides it. So they got to bring some kook pot on. And I get it. If it's a legitimate debate, right, a policy debate, then fine. But we don't need someone on to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop. You know what I mean? Or just something wacky that, I'm trying to remember what they were before. I'm
thinking of interviews with Kayleigh McEnany or Stephen Miller, where it's
just... Jenna Ellis back in the day, where I was put on with her to debate her, and it's I can't debate her. I mean, I literally would say, okay, well, back here on Earth, here are the facts, because I didn't even understand what she was talking about, because she's living in an alternative reality, and I think that is not helpful.
Right, and she's not really trying to debate you. She's looking for clips for Newsmax or looking for clips for OAN. Correct. She could care less about what you say at that point. She's trying to make her points. And it's interesting that you brought up the laptop, because I think that's actually one of the things that the media did really well in 2020 compared to 2016, where the big October surprise type story comes up right towards the end of the election. And the media did a very good job of looking at the story, looking at who was pushing it, and saying, nah, there's just nothing. This is weird. We're not going there. So you wrote a great piece about this. And do you think that we're ever going to hear the end of this as far as the laptop goes? Do you think we're going to keep hearing?
I agree with you. And this is about framing, right? The problem with 2016 was all these emails were released, and there was no acknowledgement in the framing of it that these were hacked emails by Russia, which was sort of relevant to. They were true. The emails were actually real. It's not the authenticity of the emails. It's the actor behind the release and the purpose in releasing them. And that should have been also a part of the story. And that gives you it helps you to critically evaluate how much weight you want to give to the substance. And I think in 2020, as you said, the question was, well, where are these coming from and for what purpose? And this has frustrated Republicans greatly, right? Yeah. Because it didn't work. The op didn't work the way they wanted, because the framing is on the provenance of the emails, not the substance. And by the way, I don't think the substance actually adds up to much, but whatever. That's what they want the story to be. I don't know that we'll hear the end of it, mainly because now there's been a weaponization of the government to try to launder the narratives through, these hearings and all of this stuff. I still don't think, though, that it's gotten the kind of traction that Hillary's emails did. So, we'll have to see. But I do see people popping into my Twitter feed and they're like, what about the 51 intelligence officials who lied and said that this was a information op, which is something that Trump said the other day. So like there's an echo chamber still, but I don't know that the media is biting to the same degree. But it's not going to go away for sure.
Yeah, the right wing kind of did it to themselves, though, because we were right in the thick of the Hunter Biden laptop op, and they had at least 3 different groups kind of competing with different Hunter Biden material. It was just so confusing. It was clear what they were trying to do, but I think they even confused themselves. And they're just so convinced that something is there that's really concerning and we really have to look into.
He mentions the big guy.
Yeah, the big guy. Yeah, now we've got a whole conservative movie about it that I haven't watched yet and don't really want
Meanwhile,
to.
back at the ranch, Trump literally had hundreds of top secret classified documents, and they're like, he's innocent.
Yeah. And Jared Kushner's $2 billion deal with the Saudi government is just kind of glossed over. And yeah, we can't talk about that. But we've also, again, I don't know if you saw, but I noticed that we've gotten even more Twitter files in the last couple days with new people that I have not heard of. I don't know who they are, but I had to kind of check it first to see, is this a real thing or is this somebody pretending to do the Twitter files? But Matt Taibbi, who had done the original version, is now back on Twitter and he was amplifying it. So it does look like it's from above, and it's all part of the same group. But they've of course focused a lot on the Hunter Biden laptop, and that was kind of, for them, that was the impetus for going into all of the Twitter files. But they've got a lot of grievances. It's one of many grievances. But I thought your piece on this, on the Twitter files, I think it was December, was great. I loved that you focused on the algorithms, where the right says, oh, free speech is under attack. You said, well, a lot of what's coming out in the Twitter files is, it was just people at Twitter trying their best to be as fair and balanced and helpful. And they were imperfect people who maybe made choices at the spur of the moment. Yeah, but it happens and that's life. But yeah, the focus on the algorithm is great. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that and explain how the algorithms kind of manipulate the information that we get.
Yeah, and there's not enough focus on this because I think we get so caught up in content, right? So as I mentioned, I think the whole content moderation, censorship stuff is just a red herring for what is the problem. I think the bigger issue is transparency, because that gets to the actor and purpose that I mentioned earlier. Like it's more important to have information out there, but know who is precisely putting it out there, and and understand what they might be hoping to achieve by it. And then, as you mentioned, the algorithm, which artificially inflates certain information over others. In other words, we have this idea of a marketplace of ideas, but we have a very rigged marketplace right now. I mean, if this was a securities market, it would be a hot mess, right? Because you would never know what the true value of a company is. It's like if there was some other actor, like kind of making a company look more profitable than it is. I mean, we wouldn't stand for that in the financial space because people would lose a lot of money, right?
Right.
If you were making decisions based on what stock to buy, based on bad valuation. But we have bad valuation of information in the marketplace of ideas because algorithms boost certain things and not others. And now Elon Musk has made this even worse by allowing anyone and, their mom to buy a check mark and boost their content as well. And we know, to circle this back to Russia, that, they have bought, check marks so that they can promote and get their narratives about Ukraine and other things boosted in this space. So one way to change things without actually affecting content or having to censor anything is to, add things like more friction, or you slow down the amplification of things, or you can value things differently. Like you can decide that there are certain values that you want to maximize in the algorithm. Facebook did this in the lead up to the 2020 election. They actually changed their algorithm to prioritize more reliable news. So, these conspiracy theories actually didn't get as much circulation. The question is, how do you get these companies to do that consistently? Because it's actually not profitable for them to do that.
No.
Right.
It's almost like we saw something similar in the lead up to the 2022 midterms, where we were getting bombarded with the polls say, the polls say, the polls say. It seemed like Simon Rosenberg and his group sort of dived into that, and they were like, wait a second, this poll that says this is 2 high school kids from Virginia that called 500 people sort of out of the phone book.
Oh, this was the Red Massacre prediction?
Right.
Oh,
and we had all been kind of conditioned to expect a Red Massacre, like you said, but it didn't really come down that way. And part of the reason we got conditioned to that was because I think of what you said about we just didn't really value the information correctly. We treated all of these polls like they were equal. Like, these 2 kids' Patriot polling strategies out of Virginia were equal to, Gallup or somebody. And when you give that equal amounts of weight, you're going to come up with some very misleading results. So hopefully that's another thing that we can kind of learn to stay away from going forward, because information weighting, that's fascinating. It's a good takeaway.
And I think in addition to the way, like there's 2 things going on there. One kind of gets back to the reflexive control thing, right? Like there's this assumption that was like pushed out there. And by the way, that shapes behavior. Because if you believe that there's going to be a Red Massacre, guess what? You're not going to go out and vote. Maybe you're like, I'm not going to sit and wait 10 hours in line if this is just a fait accompli. So that's a dangerous thing where the prediction or assumption then shapes the thing to make it come true, really.
Right.
And in terms of the weighting, that gets to this idea I talked about before about there's no gatekeepers. Basically, because there's no gatekeepers, there's also a flattening of authority. Everybody has the same weight. I mean, we saw this in COVID. Like some Yahoo who knows nothing about science is out there saying vaccines don't work or hydrochloroquine is the way to go. We're not able to evaluate relative sources of authority in the same way.
Yeah, there are now, the ADL covered this recently, but there are kind of random anti-vax accounts on Substack that are making, I think, a minimum of $40,000 a month on subscriptions, and it's entirely focused on anti-vax content. And who is this person? What are their qualifications? Well, usually it's none. It's nothing. They read something somewhere. They came up with something on their own. But that is a way to make a living. And as long as that's a way to make a living, there's going to be people who are going to go out and do it.
Yeah. The fact that you can monetize disinformation is really a huge issue that has not been unpacked enough.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and ask a really tough question, considering some of the stuff we've talked about thus far going forward.
Here's our optimism segment. It's going to be short, but let's give it a shot.
So what do you see that gives you hope and optimism for the future of the country? You get up every day and you go into this and, fight them as hard as you can. You've been doing this for a number of years now. What makes you get up and do that every day? What do you see that makes you think it's worth it?
Yeah, I was hoping we were going to run out of time before you asked me this question. Okay, I'll say there's a few things. Number one, there's more of us than there are of them. And when I say us to them, I'm not talking about Democrat or Republican. I'm talking about people who care about democracy, whatever their political affiliation, and who believe in the values and principles of democracy, and the people who don't. And I truly believe that that's probably a 70-30 split at most, ideally maybe 75-25 or even less. The problem is I think that we just have a challenge of trying to collectively organize and make sure that we're all sort of acting together, because one of the values of democracy is, diversity and plurality of opinion. So it's a messy tent, and it's really hard to have the same unity of purpose that the kind of authoritarian camp does, which are all in like lockstep. But it does give me hope that just numbers wise, right? And this is why you see all these anti-democratic measures being implemented across the country, because they know, right? The autocrats know that they don't have the numbers. They have to rig the system to win. And I think that ultimately that's going to backfire. The other thing that gives me hope is I really think the younger generation has had enough. I really do. I mean, we have a whole cohort of voters who have come of age during the Trump years, who are watching all this nonsense in like Tennessee and Montana, and they're like, F this. And they're now voting age.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're voting 2-1 in favor of Democrats, which is good. Yeah, and they don't buy it. You're right. They see right through it. And I think it had to get to this ridiculous point, but that's a good thing. That is a hopeful thing.
So I think that there will be a pendulum swing in that way. And then finally, I did have a third thing in my mind.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got you off track.
No, that's okay. Oh, I think that accountability is important. And I think I have been frustrated. Don't get me wrong. I'm not naive, and I, don't have my blinders on. But I do believe that accountability, especially in terms of the justice system, is coming, and that it matters, right? I know we're still waiting for Trump to be held accountable for January 6th, but hundreds of defendants have been. And by the way, when he tried to get his supporters out for him in New York, telling them to rise up and, come resist or protest or whatever, it was like crickets.
Mm-hmm.
It matters. Yeah. People are like, whoa, no, people are going to jail, after January 6th. Like this actually has consequences. So I do believe it's coming. And we've seen the indictment in Manhattan. There's going to be one in Fulton County, Georgia. And then I do believe that there are going to be charges coming from the Department of Justice. And by the way, I think just going back to sucking the air out of the room, I think if there's one thing that Americans love more than Trump's crazy, it's true crime. And so, his like chart, like every legal drama of his is going to take over. And I think it may be the one thing that's going to make it hard for him to cut through that noise.
Makes sense.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Asha, thank you very much for coming on with us today. It was a blast, very enlightening to talk to you about some of this stuff. Anything you want to talk about you've got coming up project-wise?
No, I'm just really trying to stay on top of all of the different legal things, not just with Trump, this lawsuit that Disney has filed against DeSantis. This is, trying to keep track of all of this. I think the courts are on the front lines, and I just want to be able to explain it to people.
Well, go check out her Substack and go check out her podcast with Renato Mariotti. It's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It's complicated.
It is.
That's a great name.
I've gotten to listen to one. I'm going to listen to more. I love what you're doing, and we really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much.
Thanks again, Asha. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can go to didnothingwrongpod.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at James, the word 4, and the letter M, all one word, and Grizza BJJ, Grza BJJ, as well as DNW Pod. Thanks again for tuning in, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.